Hello, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on analysis, gap, context, and content. My name is Rhonda Honke, and I'll be your host for this presentation. I'm looking forward to going through the content with you, sharing with you what I've learned from the module, as well as how I'm going to be applying it towards my learning problem. Are you ready? Let's get to it. So we're going to start by looking at needs assessment versus needs analysis. From there, we'll delve a little bit more into the learner analysis, context, and content analysis before talking about how I will be applying that to my learning problem. Now you'll notice a quote on the right, "Learning is experience, everything else is just information." That's from Einstein. And it's a quote that really speaks to me here because quite often I will see a lot of practitioners rushing through this part of the analysis just to kind of check off the box in instructional design. For me, this is way more important. This isn't just about gathering information or completing a chart. It's about really getting some information together so that we as instructional designers can design the best experience possible to drive the best outcomes for people. So we're going to start by talking about needs assessment versus needs analysis. And I wanted to start here because in my world, which is more along the lines of corporate training, we often will start here. So we'll start by understanding first the desired future performance of the organization and the people who will be working within it. So in the folks that I work with, it's often something related to a change in the market or maybe change in products. Perhaps there's some new technologies coming on board, but there's something that's going to be driving a change and things that their employees are going to have to do differently. So once we understand that, then we actually get into what the current performance is. So how are employees performing relative to those future expectations? And if there is a gap there, then we identify what that gap is. And that's really the key part of needs assessment. From there, we start to delve into what is the root cause of that gap. Now, sometimes we find that it's an organizational issue. We'll look at organizational analysis and we might find things like job design or organizational culture, or maybe the way metrics or goals are set up. Maybe it's even compensation structures that are driving some of that gap. Those things we can't fix with training. So there are non-training interventions that need to be added there to address those gaps. However, sometimes there are some elements of knowledge, skill, and ability that are really contributing to that gap. And if we identify those, that's when we start getting into the needs analysis and really digging into them and understanding them well. So when we get into then a learner analysis, our goal is to really understand the learner so we can leverage what we learn to develop coursework and interactions that deliver the best outcomes. So what do we want to learn about that individual? We want to know about their previous experience, what's motivating them to participate in learning, how they like to learn, and what tools they like to use to learn, as well as the cognitive and physical abilities of the learners, their attitudes towards the content, even the company itself, and the delivery system. It's even helpful to understand some basic group characteristics to just really understand what's getting that learner across the finish line. So the next question becomes, how do we collect data to help us with that? Well, questionnaires are certainly helpful, as are focus groups. We can certainly get people together to talk about it. Then we can look for research reports. And those could be external about general characteristics, or there might be internal demographics reports that we can run on a target group. Either way, those reports can be really insightful. From there, we can also do personal observations of people in their natural habitat or do one-on-one interviews. It might be a combination of a variety of those different methodologies. But really what we're doing is looking at it from a place of curiosity and really trying to understand the learner. Once we have that information, it becomes a question of, well, what do we do with it? And in the reading that was required for this particular module, there's a really great tool that I've started to actually apply this week. And it's a learner and context analysis tool where it actually has 3 columns, where the first speaks to the questions that we might ask about the learner. The middle column is where we'll capture the answers, whether we are getting them from a questionnaire or a focus group. But the third column is where we start looking at the implications for course design. So let's say one of the things we asked about was previous experience that people had with the subject matter. And we might find that some people are extremely knowledgeable and some people have no knowledge at all. So the implications for our course design is that we're going to have to create multiple learning paths, because some learners will start with zero knowledge coming in, and others, will need to bypass some of maybe the more introductory information. Now, when I looked at this particular tool, it's great. However, it is focused a lot more on academia. So I've actually made a few adjustments to the tool and template for myself so I can apply it more in a corporate setting. Once we've kind of gotten a better understanding of the learner, we need to understand the environment around them so that we can think about how that environment might influence our instructional design decisions. Now, there's really two focuses of context that we need to look at. The first is the performance setting. And the performance setting is where individuals are actually going to be applying their learning. So what is that environment they're going back into after training is completed? Why that's important for us is, imagine this. You've got an employee who attends training. They're really excited about it, but they go back to their day job only to find that their leader is not very supportive, and neither are their peers. That particular learner might need additional supports like outside coaching, or maybe some tools and some checklists, or maybe even some, guidance around how to work with a leader who isn't supportive of what they're trying to, apply at work. So once we understand that performance setting, we can really start to think about, what that looks like and how that will impact a learner. The other piece we need to look at is the learning environment. So in traditional classroom instruction, we as an instructor actually control that learning environment. We set the tone. We know exactly what a learner is going to experience because we're there, we can see it. When we're looking at online or blended solutions, it's a little bit different. We don't know whether people are doing the work at their desks in the middle of their day job, and if that's a busy cubicle area or if they have a quiet office. We don't know if they're doing it at home on the weekend and they've got, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old running around like I do. We don't know if they're going to be accessing this on their phone in a busy airport while they're traveling. So if we can understand where and how they're going to be accessing learning, then it will make sure we have the right tools to support that instruction. Then we can get into content analysis. So once we understand what that future state is and where those gaps are, then we can look at what are the required competencies a person has to display in order to meet that future state. We can break those competencies down into key knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we can evaluate the current levels of those competencies that are being, shown by employees at different target levels. That will help us identify the gaps and identify the content that we need to provide. It'll also help us prioritize the training needs. So now that we've covered all of those areas, let's talk about how that can be applied in learning, and in this case, towards my learning problem. So if we look at my learning problem, really I had two big questions. How can I leverage social tools to build relationships and community that supports ongoing learning post-course completion? And how can I do that when courses are not subject to a cohort, but continuous intake? So if we go back to look at this chart, the particular program that I'm working on relates to innovation within a corporate setting, and it's focused particularly at the leadership level. So in order to understand the desired future performance, we've done a couple of things. We had a bit of a scoping session going into the program, and that really helped us understand what we were getting ourselves into. We were also provided with a copy of the corporate strategy, so we could see how this tied into the corporate goals and the future state the organization was striving to achieve. And then we were able to actually run a Savvy Start meeting where we were able to get some key stakeholders and subject matter experts together to really talk about, what was this going to look like in practice, and what were we really expecting people to be able to do in order to drive, the outcomes that we're looking for. So we did that, and then we were able to start looking at current performance. So we were able to start running some reports on leadership performance. We were able to engage in some interviews with leaders as well as some key stakeholders, including the folks that are responsible for innovation, who have been working with leaders in some cases on projects, or working with employees who are sharing feedback about leaders. And from there, we've identified a gap. We were then able to start looking at the root cause of that gap. And what we found, not surprisingly, was there were some organizational issues, particularly around strategic alignment, communication, how leadership performance was measured, even some compensation potential challenges in the structure. So there were a number of things that we know we can't address with training, but those have been flagged for some of the other stakeholders in the corporate world to start tackling those. What we did find was a gap, however, also in knowledge, skills, and ability, which led us to start down the path of needs analysis, which is what we're doing right now. Because we only have essentially till the end of March to get this program off the ground from an MVP perspective, we've been able to actually launch the learner and the context analysis simultaneously. So we created a questionnaire survey that went out to leaders on Friday, and we were able to do an interview with a learning and development subject matter expert who is responsible for overall leadership development. So she had really great insight into the leadership group around things like characteristics, how they've been trained previously in other courses and other content, different tools and techniques and modalities that have been applied, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well. She was able to share feedback around learning preferences from that particular group. And she was able to provide me with details on learning paths that the different learner groups are taking to help me understand kind of what they're coming in with. On the context side, we were able to identify some stakeholders kind of surrounding this innovation group who were open to providing some input into context. We were also able to interview a different learning and development subject matter expert who was able to provide us with some insight there around, some of the, I'll say, forces for and forces against the work that we're going to be doing. The interview with the innovation leaders was really helpful because they were able to share with us how they see things fitting together, other stakeholder groups that they work with, what's gone well for them, what hasn't gone well for them. So that was really insightful. They're also going through their own strategy process right now, which we were able to hook into. We were provided with some internal documents that we could look at around things like metrics and scorecards, those kinds of things, which gave us insight into how leaders' performance are measured and kind of what they're held to task for. And so all that data is going to be coming in this week, which will be really helpful. Our intent is to take that data, identify where we need to have things like focus groups, traditional interviews. We want to develop and validate personas on the learner side to get a really good understanding for later testing, because we're assuming there will be an e-learning solution. And we also are looking at potentially doing some observation. Now, we haven't started the content analysis piece yet, but I'm looking forward to applying that as well in the coming weeks. So from our learnings to date, we have some hypotheses that will either be validated or will be, crushed in the coming days with the data that we get. What we do know is that we will need some flexible options, as our leaders are going to be accessing this from different geographies, time zones. Some of our leaders travel a fair bit, so they might be accessing things on their phone at an airport, where others are going to probably do it on evenings or weekends outside of their office time. So we need to be flexible. We also know that some of the leaders are coming in with zero background and knowledge in this area, while others are going to come in having done some project work previously or having supported project work. So we will need to have multiple learning paths for them to follow so that we can accommodate those that have a little bit more knowledge, and also provide additional supports for those that are coming in with limited background. The geography we're expecting is going to require us to use some kind of an e-learning component to what we're doing with some additional tools. What we also heard is that this particular group of learners appears to like to connect and they like to interact. So we will have to have some level of community engagement, whether that is through tools like Skype or moderated webinars, which is what they have been using before, or some kind of other social space that allows for peer learning and support, recognizing that we expect some people would opt out. And so we would need to be able to provide some additional, whether it's sort of moderated webinars or pre-recorded webinars or other tools that those folks who aren't going to engage with peers will still be accessing, key elements of learning and not be left behind. So in conclusion, what can we glean out of this analysis step? And for me, this analysis phase is really critical. It's something that I don't gloss over very often. And this little diagram, though it's really simplistic in nature, really helps me visualize how it all comes together. So we start with that needs assessment process of looking at, hey, what does the future look like? How are we performing today? And what is the gap? From that, we can drive out a needs analysis if we identify that skills, knowledge, and abilities is a key issue that's contributing to the gap. And for us to do a really solid needs analysis, we have to look at the learner and understand them. We also have to look at the context, so what's happening around them in their regular work environment, but also in their learning environment. And then we need to look at content and determining, what that could look like. So I hope that this short presentation is helpful for you in your learning journey. It was certainly helpful for me to put it together. And I look forward to learning from all of you as we continue on this journey through this course together and this program together. And I thank you for taking time to join me for this particular presentation. Keep learning and have fun.